could not be happier. It's just so important to me that you all know what's going on in our denomination around this issue, and feel like you've had a chance to learn a little bit about it before our bishop is here, so that you can ask him questions. It's pretty hard to know what questions you want to ask if you don't really have the full picture of what's happening. So thank you so much for being here tonight. In a moment, we're going to start with prayer, because I didn't do that last time, and I thought I should have. So we're going to do it this time. And then basically I'm going to talk at you for a little while and give you some information, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'll do my best to answer them. 2 weeks ago there were a few that I couldn't answer, and I didn't write them down. So tonight Wendy's going to write down anything that I say, I'm going to have to look that up. Wendy's going to write it down so I remember what it is that I said that I would look up. Let's see. 2 weeks ago we talked about just what General Conference is, how it works, how many people are there. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about the history of how we got to this place where we are as a denomination, and the specific parts of our book of discipline that are the controversial parts, the parts that people are really arguing over, so that you have a sense of, again, what is it that's happening? What are people, why is it that our denomination is so stuck? And we'll be able to think about that, because you've seen the language that people see as problematic. Mm-hmm. But before we start, let's pray together. Gracious and loving God, we are so grateful to be your church, to gather in different times and different places around our belief in you and our belief in love and our belief in goodness. Be with us this night as we continue learning and talking about this really difficult issue in our church. Help us to understand where things are going so that we can be informed and thoughtful as the story of the United Methodist Church unfolds. Thank you for all those who have come and taken time out of their evening to be here, and for all those who have provided us with snacks and support for this series of learning sessions. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So, quick review. There is a special General Conference of the United Methodist Church in February 2019, a few months from now. We got to having this because we reached an impasse, a complete inability within our denomination to come to a place of resolution around a few different issues, all of which involved LGBTQ community. The four primary issues, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, are the ordination of gay people, the United Methodist clergy performing gay marriages, the use of United Methodist buildings for gay weddings, and the use of United Methodist funds in support of any LGBTQ caucus or organization, which somebody asked last time whether Reconciling Ministries is an official group within the denomination. The reason that they cannot be is because then they would be receiving United Methodist funding, and that is specifically against the discipline. So Reconciling Ministries is the branch or the group, the organization of United Methodists who are promoting full inclusion of the LGBTQ community, but they are not an official agency for exactly this reason. So those are the primary points of contention within our church, or our denomination right now. I gave you this handout. I stole it from the North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church because it had all the things I wanted to talk about in it. So thank you, North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. But I also thought that some of it might be helpful to actually have it, be able to take it home and read it, especially the language from the discipline. So rather than do a slideshow, I thought I'd just give it to you to take with you. In terms of history around this issue, until 1972, nobody was talking about LGBTQ anything in the Methodist Church. It just had never been a topic for discussion, nor had there ever been anything specifically put into our Book of Discipline around the LGBTQ community, their rights, their involvement in the church, and so on. And then in 1968, at the General Conference, they had decided that there should be a special committee that would kind of look through our social principles and make some recommendations to the next General Conference, to the 1972 General Conference, around some specific social issues, and homosexuality was one of them. So at the 1972 General Conference, they presented their findings, and one of the things that they said was, homosexuals, no less than heterosexuals, are persons of sacred worth, who need the ministry and guidance of the church in their struggles for human fulfillment, as well as the spiritual and emotional care of a fellowship which enables reconciling relationships with God, with others, and with self. Further, we insist that all persons are entitled to have their human and civil rights ensured. Just doesn't seem that controversial, that statement, but it was the beginning of where we are now. In response to that statement made by this legislative committee, a delegate from Indiana wanted to know what was meant by homosexuals would have their human and civil rights ensured. And the subsequent discussion was the first argument on the General Conference floor, and they've been going on ever since. It was that discussion that led to the language in our Book of Discipline that says, the United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. That phrase, that sentence, is one of the primary points of contention today, whether or not that should stay in the Book of Discipline. And when we get next week, when we talk about the proposals that are going to General Conference, you'll see that each proposal specifically addresses that sentence and whether that sentence should stay in our Book of Discipline. But prior to 1972, it wasn't there. Since 1972, we've been fighting about it. It's not in that. Actually, it does come later. I'll point it out to you when we come to it. These are my own little notes that I'm reading from, but it does show up in a few pages. So, now we'll flip over to what you're looking at. After 1972, you'll see sort of a rundown on the first page of the handout of all the General Conferences since and what happened. It's never not been under discussion at a General Conference. 1972, that phrase was put in. Then in 1976, they added the 3 rules around not using church funds to in any way promote or support homosexuality. In 1980, they talked about it, and they said we're going to leave the 1972 and 1976 language as it is. We're not going to change anything. In 84, they got more specific around clergy, and they said the standard for ordained clergy is a commitment to fidelity in marriage and celibacy in singleness, and self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not to be accepted as candidates, ordained as ministers, or appointed to serve in the United Methodist Church. The phrase self-avowed practicing homosexual is another key phrase. You can be United Methodist clergy and gay if you're not practicing, right? Or you can be United Methodist clergy and gay and be in the closet. If you don't self-avow, then nobody knows that you can be a gay clergy person. But if you want a full life of being out of the closet and in a relationship, you cannot be United Methodist clergy. That's the second point of great discussion at General Conference. In 2000, you'll see how this would swing back and forth. In 2000, the more progressive end of the spectrum got added, we implore families and churches not to reject or condemn their lesbian and gay members and friends. And in 2004, the delegates were able to have a statement of unity in which they said, as United Methodists, we will remain in covenant with one another, even in the midst of disagreement, and affirm our commitment to work together for the common mission of making disciples throughout the world. And then they reaffirmed everything else that they had already decided, all the other language that they'd already decided. In 2008, they passed a new resolution opposing homophobia and heterosexism. Some would say there's some irony in that. But, in 2012, what was, for me, one of the most disheartening things to happen in the General Conference, there were several motions to simply say, we don't agree. We agree to not agree. But they couldn't agree to not agree. And so those failed, those motions to at least acknowledge that we agree to disagree also failed. So we get to 2016, which was the last General Conference, and again there were dozens, maybe hundreds, of different pieces of legislation being discussed that had to do with all these particular points we've been talking about. And it got so contentious and so difficult, they simply couldn't move forward. I had invited my friend Joy Barrett to be with us tonight. She has been a delegate to the last, I don't know how many, probably at least 6 General Conferences. And she's talked with me about what it was like on the conference floor in 2016. I really wanted her to be here tonight and be able to tell you a little bit about that experience. Unfortunately, she's the lead pastor in Chelsea, and they're having a big event. I don't know what it is, but she said, I really would love to be there, and yet I can't because we have something happening. But she's talked about how just painful it was to see people who really felt they were being faithful to how they understand Christianity, how they understand the gospel, how they understand the role of the church, but could not get to a point where they could even really talk to each other. I don't know if any of you listened to the live stream, but you got some of that. It just was horrible, and it felt so not Christian. Like, why can't we at least have a conversation about this? So finally, Adam Hamilton, who many of you I'm sure have heard of, was a delegate there from Kansas, and he stood up and he said, bishops, you are our leaders, we need your help. We're not getting anywhere on our own. And so the bishops tried to be, this was sort of put in their lap, and then they had to figure out what to do. And the first thing they said was, okay, we're not going to have any more discussion at this General Conference around human sexuality. It's clear we can't. We're just not getting anywhere. So they kind of stopped the conversation around these issues. And then they made this decision that they would appoint what they called the Commission on the Way Forward. And the Commission on the Way Forward would, well, I'll tell you in a few minutes what their mission was, but the intention was that they would spend a couple of years really looking into the issue, hearing the different sides, and figuring out how to get us out of this stuck place, because we've been so stuck with this. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Commission on the Way Forward in a minute. You do have in front of you really all of the sort of controversial pieces of the Book of Discipline. This is directly from the Book of Discipline. The first one is a lot of what I was reading to you a few minutes ago. We affirm that sexuality is God's good gift to all persons. We call everyone to responsible stewardship of this sacred gift. And then sexual relations are affirmed only within the covenant of monogamous heterosexual marriage. A little bit further in that same box is that statement I read a few minutes ago. All persons, regardless of age, gender, marital status, or sexual orientation, are entitled to have their human and civil rights ensured and to be protected against violence. You sort of see there's both parts of, or both ends of the continuum reflected even just in this language. The piece about sacred worth is at the top of the next page. All persons are individuals of sacred worth, created in the image of God. All persons need the ministry of the church. And then the United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. And then, 2 sentences later, we implore families and churches not to reject or condemn lesbian and gay members and friends. We commit ourselves to be in ministry for and with all persons. It's kind of all over the place, right? You see how conflicted we are as a denomination just in one paragraph, where there's such different nuances to what is being said. But these are at least things that were agreed upon at some point. Now they're not agreed upon anymore. The next box down, you'll see, this is the actual wording of some of the pieces we talked about earlier. Self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not to be in ministry in the church. Homosexual unions shall not be conducted by our ministers or conducted in our churches. No annual conference, board, agency, committee, commission, or council shall give United Methodist funds to any gay caucus or group. A bishop, and this is a piece, this last one is important for understanding sort of some of the challenges of clergy around this. A bishop, clergy member of an annual conference, local pastor on honorable administrative location, or diaconal minister may be tried when charged with practices declared by the United Methodist Church to be incompatible with Christian teaching, including but not limited to being a self-avowed practicing homosexual, or conducting ceremonies which celebrate homosexual unions, or performing same-sex wedding ceremonies. So that basically says that if I were to do a same-sex wedding, I could be tried and lose my credentials. And that's something that we within this congregation have really struggled with, because we've had couples who have asked us. We have a couple where one of them has been part of this church his entire life, but we could not do his wedding to his husband. Because we know that there are other clergy in the state of Michigan who would bring us up on charges. And the cost is too high, because the cost is to lose our ordination, to be defrauded. So that's the other piece that is really controversial, and it's one that is, especially since same-sex marriage has passed in the country, it's now legal in the country. It's very frustrating, I think, to see our church so in conflict over this particular piece of things. And we don't know. We don't know what the resolution is going to be. But I thought you might like to see this. This is straight from the book. Like, this is what it actually says. This is what's causing all the trouble. So the Council of Bishops created this Commission on a Way Forward after the 2016 General Conference. It has 32 members. 8 of them are bishops. They're from different countries in the world. They're African bishops and American bishops, and I think a Filipino bishop, I believe. There are 11 laity. 11 elders and 2 deacons. In the United Methodist Church, there are 2 forms of ordination. One is that you can be ordained as an elder, which is what I am, and that basically means that you're called to care for a church. That's where you feel your calling is to care for the worship and order and sacraments of the church. The other kind of ordination is what's called to deacon, ordination as a deacon. It's fairly new, it's about 20 years old. And deacons are called to sort of create a bridge between the church and the world. So oftentimes a deacon might be a pastoral counselor or a social worker, or now many of our youth ministers and children's ministry people in the United Methodist Church, music ministers, a lot of those folks may be ordained as deacons. So when you see that 11 elders and 2 deacons, that's what that's referring to. They employed a professional facilitator to work with the commission so they could talk to each other. These 32 people. And they had 3 bishops who were serving as sort of a moderator team. They did a lot of work around the ground rules. They created a covenant of what was expected in terms of listening to each other, being able to speak truth in a safe place, how to have a productive conversation where you're clearly in disagreement. And then they moved forward from there. Their mission, as given to them by the bishops, was to bring together persons deeply committed to the future of the church, with an openness to developing new relationships with each other and exploring the potential future of our denomination in light of General Conference and subsequent annual jurisdictional and central conference actions. And at the top of the next page, you have a nice picture. This is the commission on the page. You can see them very well on there. It gives a little bit more about the charge from the bishops there. The mission I've just read to you, then the vision, maximize the presence of the United Methodist Witness in as many places in the world as possible, that allows for as much contextual differentiation as possible, and that balances an approach to different theological understandings of human sexuality with a desire for as much unity as possible. So they really were trying to look at how can we acknowledge the differences in culture, because the difference between an African country's culture and New York City is huge. So how can we create space for difference in culture? How can we create space for difference in theology and still stay as united as possible? That was what they were working towards. And then the scope, this was an interesting piece to me I had not seen before. Be open to new ways of embodying unity that moves us beyond where we are in the present impasse and cycle of action and reaction around ministry and human sexuality. Give consideration to greater freedom and flexibility to a future United Methodist Church that will redefine our present connectionality. In other words, we can do this differently. We can organize ourselves differently. We don't have to keep the same set of limits around how we're organized that have gotten us to this place. And I think that was the first time anybody said, okay, let's start from scratch. Let's see what would happen if we said, okay, we don't have to stay in conferences and we don't have to necessarily all be part of this same grouping of beliefs. We can have different beliefs and maybe organize ourselves differently. So that made a lot of room for creative thinking. And you'll see when we look at the different proposals next week, how some of that creative thinking played out. There were lots of rumors for a long time about, there's going to be conferences within conferences, and there's going to be progressive conferences, and there are going to be conservative conferences, but they finally came up with, here's some creative ways we might be able to solve this problem. One of the things that they did was to try to figure out, what do we have in common as United Methodists? Is there a set of core beliefs that we can say, yes, this is the starting point. If we're United Methodists, we all start here. And that's what's at the top of the next page. If Jesus is the vine, we are the branches. The creeds are United Methodist Articles of Religion and Confession of Faith. Wesley's general rules: do no harm, do all the good you can, stay in love with God. Disciplined engagement with Scripture, works of piety, mercy and justice, the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist, small group accountability and support, and a connectional way of life that includes superintendency and itinerancy and conferencing. They kind of came to those as, this is common ground. There's some people that say, I don't know that I believe in the Nicene Creed, so I don't know if I really think that that's common ground for me, but that was sort of what they said, this is the starting point. And then partway through, this last piece that's here is from their mid-work report. And I thought it was interesting because this is what they were aiming for. The goals for their final report. They wanted it to be focused on unity and the mission of the church, find a common theological center, a new church that doesn't look like the current church, so that's really this question of creative structure, dynamic, flexible, and contextual connectionalism, again, creative structure. Enabling a way for groups to be in ministry separately while sharing some common ministry. Enabling people with contradictory convictions to flourish within the church. Possibly have multiple versions of the Book of Discipline, which would have been heretical until 10 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago. Jesus' call to unity may look like associations or affiliated churches rather than one denomination. Trying to keep our global connection in some way, and then allowing for those who don't adopt for a new version of the church to leave it. That's what that last piece really is about. How do we make room for people to leave the denomination? So that's the work that's brought us to this place. Those are the issues, the pieces of the discipline, and then the process of the way forward that have brought us to where we are. And the Way Forward Commission came up with 3 proposals for ways that the church might move forward. And those are I'll go into those in detail next week when we get together so that you can see what those look like. The Council of Bishops those have been presented to the Council of Bishops, and the Council of Bishops has sort of said, we're putting our weight behind this one. It's called the One Church Plan, because they really want to see the church stay together if possible. But they have no voice and vote at General Conference, so they have voice in that they conduct the business, but they don't really have vote, or they can't do a whole lot. So that's where we are. And now I'd love to hear what questions you might have about. This is so dry. Church polity is like the most dry stuff in the world, and there's no way to make it interesting. But yeah, what questions do you have about where we are at this point? Yeah, Jen.
The council that got together has been working on this for the last 3 years. I know you said some of the countries that were representative, but do you know the breakdown by continent, by how many U.S. representatives there were, and what the age group was of this council?
I don't know specifically. I would have to look it up. I mean, I know it was fairly diverse, but I don't know the exact breakdown. So Wendy? Actually, it's fairly easy to look that up though too. If you get onto the United Methodist Church website and you search Mission on the Way Forward, you'll find a listing of the 32 members, where they come from, what their role in the church is. So that's a pretty easy one to find. I don't know if it has age. It's one thing I'm not sure about. And the issue of age is a significant one in that we're seeing a generation men for whom many, they just don't care about this stuff, you know? And they're looking at this denomination saying, wait, it's legal in the country, but you guys can't get it together. Now, I'm sure that there are more conservative young people too, but I do think that's sort of a hot button part of this discussion is, are we going to continue to shrink as a denomination because of this conflict that we're in? Other questions?
Basic question. I keep seeing this phrase over and over again, incompatible with Christian teaching. Okay? And I'm not aware that Jesus ever had anything to say about this, nor does it appear much at all in the New Testament. I mean, we get that from the Old Testament, but we also, we don't keep kosher either.
Right.
So what do they keep coming up with that makes them justify this kind of restriction?
The incompatible with Christian teaching? Yes. I don't know is the first answer, because my understanding of what Jesus taught personally is so contradictory to that. But I think there is so much fear around same-sex relationships that people can't believe that Jesus would have thought that that was okay. Though it is true, Jesus never addresses this topic directly. There's no word from Jesus that says yay or nay around same-sex relationships. So it's a matter of interpretation. Do you interpret what he says and does as being inclusive or as placing limits around people's sexual expression? Doesn't answer your question, really. Yeah. Sherry.
Two things. One, the first thing I noticed in looking at the council was no youth. No, they would just be appalled with this discussion, I think. And the second thing, if there indeed was a split, what would the bishops do?
Well, that takes a crystal ball. But, I mean, there are a few things that I can say about the possibility of a split. I was telling a few people before we started tonight that the far right end of the United Methodist spectrum has organized and they call them